At 23, George Soros had exactly £17 in his bank account, and a mentor who told him he'd never succeed in finance 6 months later. Everything changed. What happened between that devastating rejection and his first breakthrough didn't just launch a legendary career. It revealed that sometimes the people who crush your dreams accidentally teach you exactly what you need to succeed. London, England, March 15, 1953. The London School of Economics sits in grey morning fog like a fortress of intellectual authority. Its Gothic revival buildings house some of Britain's most brilliant minds, where future prime ministers debate policy, where Nobel Prize winners shape economic theory, where the intellectual elite of the post-war world gather to rebuild civilization from the ashes of fascism and depression. But in a small office on the 3rd floor of the old building, a very different kind of education is taking place, a lesson about failure, rejection, and what happens when the people who should believe in you decide you're not worth their investment. George Soros sits across from Professor Henry Daniels, his thesis advisor, his academic mentor, the man who was supposed to guide his entry into British intellectual life. George is 23 years old, thin from rationing his meals to stretch his meager funds, wearing his only decent suit, a hand-me-down from a refugee assistance organization that's been mended so many times, the original fabric is barely visible. His shoes are polished but cracked. His shirt is clean but frayed. Everything about his appearance screams poverty disguised as respectability. Professor Daniels represents everything George aspires to become. 62 years old, educated at Oxford and Cambridge, author of influential papers on monetary policy, advisor to the Bank of England, respected member of London's financial establishment. His office walls display diplomas, awards, photographs with cabinet ministers, all the markers of academic and professional success that George dreams of achieving. But this morning, Professor Daniels is about to destroy those dreams with surgical precision. But there was something George Soros didn't know about what his mentor was really thinking. George, Professor Daniels begins, settling back in his leather chair like a judge delivering a verdict. We need to discuss your future in economics. George straightens, hopeful. He's spent 2 years at LSE studying under Karl Popper, absorbing philosophical frameworks about knowledge and fallibility, developing theories about reflexivity in financial markets, writing papers that challenge conventional economic wisdom. He believes he's found his calling, believes he has insights that could revolutionize economic thinking, believes Professor Daniels recognizes his potential. Yes, sir. I've been working on my thesis proposal about market psychology and… Professor Daniels waves his hand dismissively. George, stop. Just stop. The words hit like physical blows. George's enthusiasm dies mid-sentence. I've been observing your work for 2 years. Daniels continues. Your academic performance, your theoretical contributions, your potential for original research, and I'm afraid I must be brutally honest with you. George waits, sensing what's coming but hoping he's wrong. You don't have what it takes for serious academic economics. Your thinking is too unconventional, too philosophical, too divorced from practical application. Academic economics requires rigorous mathematical modeling, statistical analysis, empirical research methods. It requires the kind of systematic thinking that, frankly, you don't demonstrate. The office falls silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on Daniels's bookshelf, measuring the seconds as George's academic dreams crumble. Furthermore, Daniels continues, your background makes you unsuitable for British financial institutions. You're a Hungarian refugee with a pronounced accent, no family connections, no inherited wealth, no social standing. The City of London operates on relationships built over generations. You're an outsider who will always be an outsider. George stares at his mentor, processing these words that feel designed to destroy not just his career prospects, but his sense of belonging anywhere in British society. You won't believe what Professor Daniels said next. My recommendation is that you abandon economics entirely. Consider returning to Hungary when political conditions allow, or perhaps immigrate to America where they're less particular about backgrounds. But George, continuing to pursue finance in London, is a waste of your time and mine. You simply don't fit the requirements for success in this field. The words hang in the air like a death sentence. 2 years of study, all his hopes for intellectual achievement, his dreams of financial success, his belief that hard work could overcome the disadvantages of being a refugee, all dismissed by the man whose opinion matters most in determining his academic future. George looks at Professor Daniels, this pillar of British intellectual establishment who represents everything he wanted to become, and realizes something profound. His mentor doesn't just doubt his abilities, he fundamentally misunderstands what George brings to economic thinking. Professor Daniels, George says quietly, May I ask why you're telling me this now, after 2 years of supervision? Because I hoped you'd recognize your limitations naturally and adjust your expectations accordingly. Since that hasn't happened, directness becomes necessary. And you believe my unconventional thinking disqualifies me from economic success? I know it does. Economics is a science, George. It requires systematic methodology, not philosophical speculation. It requires institutional credibility, not outsider perspectives. It requires conforming to established frameworks, not challenging fundamental assumptions. George stands up slowly. Thank you for your honesty, Professor. I hope you'll consider my advice seriously. Oh, I will. But what George Soros was thinking in that moment would shock his mentor. George walks out of Professor Daniels' office and into the grey London morning, carrying £17, a rejected thesis proposal, and something else. Absolute clarity about what he needs to do next. Not because his mentor inspired him, but because his mentor revealed the precise limitations of conventional economic thinking that George can exploit. On the steps of LSE, George sits down and thinks through everything Professor Daniels said. Every criticism, every dismissal, every reason why George doesn't fit British financial establishment expectations. And, slowly, methodically, George begins to see each supposed weakness as a potential strength. Unconventional thinking. In markets dominated by groupthink, unconventional perspectives identify opportunities others miss. Outsiders' status. Outsiders aren't invested in maintaining systems that insiders need to preserve, so they can recognize when those systems are failing. Philosophical approach. Markets are driven by human psychology and belief systems, not just mathematical models. Lack of institutional connections. Independence from establishment consensus allows for contrarian positions that institutional players can't take. Hungarian refugee background. Experience with system collapse provides insights into how apparently stable arrangements can disintegrate rapidly. Professor Daniels intended to crush George's confidence by listing his deficiencies. Instead, he accidentally provided George with a blueprint for competitive advantage. Right at this point, everything was about to change. George walks to the library and spends the next 12 hours researching something Professor Daniels would never approve of: practical finance instead of academic theory. He studies currency markets, arbitrage opportunities, emerging financial instruments. He reads about successful traders who made fortunes by betting against conventional wisdom. He analyzes historical cases where outsiders outperformed insiders by thinking differently about market dynamics. By evening, George has a plan. Not an academic plan approved by Professor Daniels, but a practical plan that leverages every supposed weakness his mentor identified as actual strengths. The next morning, George begins systematically approaching every small financial firm in London. Not prestigious merchant banks that require family connections, not established institutions that demand conventional credentials, but newer firms, smaller operations, entrepreneurial ventures that might value intellectual ability over social pedigree. The rejections come fast and predictably. His accent marks him as foreign. His refugee background makes firms nervous about security clearances. His lack of connections eliminates him from consideration at relationship-dependent institutions. His unconventional academic focus confuses personnel managers who expect standard economics training. But George persists. Not because he's optimistic, but because he's methodical. Every rejection teaches him something about what different firms actually value. Every interview reveals gaps between what firms claim to want and what they actually need. Every conversation provides information about market opportunities that conventional finance ignores. After 6 weeks of rejections, George meets Jonathan Green. Jonathan Green runs Green & Associates, a tiny arbitrage firm with 4 employees, focusing on currency discrepancies between London and continental European markets. It's not prestigious work, not academically respected, not socially impressive. But it requires exactly what George offers: intellectual analysis of currency relationships, willingness to take contrarian positions, ability to spot opportunities that others miss. Mr. Soros, Green says during their interview, your academic background is unusual for currency trading. Yes, sir. Most of our competitors hire from traditional finance programs. They understand established trading methods, conventional currency relationships, standard arbitrage techniques. George nods, expecting rejection. But we're not trying to compete with established methods. We're trying to find opportunities that established methods miss. Your philosophical approach to market psychology might help us identify patterns that mathematical models don't capture. You won't believe what happened next. I'm offering you a position, junior analyst, minimal salary but commission on profitable trades. Are you interested? George stares at Jonathan Green, this small firm owner who just offered him everything Professor Daniels said he'd never achieve. A position in London, finance based precisely on the unconventional thinking that Daniels claimed disqualified him. Yes, sir. Very much interested. Good. Start Monday. And George, forget everything you learned about academic economics. We trade reality, not theory. George Soros begins work at Green & Associates on April 20th, 1953. His starting salary is £8 per week, barely enough for rent and food. His desk is a shared table in a cramped office overlooking an alley. His equipment consists of a calculator, a telephone, and currency rate sheets updated twice daily. But for the first time since arriving in London, George feels like he's where he belongs. Not because the work is easy, but because the work rewards exactly the kind of thinking Professor Daniels dismissed as worthless. Currency arbitrage requires identifying temporary price discrepancies between different markets. A pound might be worth $4.2 in London, but $4.3 in Paris, creating profit opportunities for traders quick enough to exploit the difference. Most firms use mathematical models to spot these discrepancies, but George brings something else: analysis of why discrepancies occur. George studies not just currency prices but currency psychology. Why do British traders value sterling differently than French traders? What political events create temporary market confusion? How do news reports affect trader behavior in different countries? When do rational economic factors give way to emotional responses? His first profitable trade comes 3 weeks after starting. George notices that morning news about British steel production caused sterling to strengthen in London, but hadn't yet affected continental markets. He convinces Jonathan Green to buy sterling in London and sell it in Frankfurt, capturing the price difference before other traders recognize the arbitrage opportunity. Profit, £47. George's commission, £9.40, more than his entire weekly salary. But what happened in the next few months shocked everyone. George develops what he calls reflexivity analysis, studying how trader beliefs shape market reality, which in turn shapes trader beliefs. Instead of treating currency prices as purely mathematical relationships, he analyzes them as psychological phenomena influenced by political events, social attitudes, and collective emotions. This approach allows George to predict market movements that mathematical models miss. When French political uncertainty creates currency volatility, George anticipates how that volatility will spread to other European markets. When German economic reports surprise investors, George predicts secondary effects on sterling and Dutch guilder relationships. His trading profits compound rapidly. £47 becomes £200, becomes £800. His commissions grow from pocket change to substantial income. Jonathan Green promotes him twice in 4 months, from junior analyst to senior analyst to associate trader. By September, George Soros is earning more than Professor Daniels' academic salary. By December, he's managing Green & Associates' largest currency positions. By March 1954, exactly 1 year after Professor Daniels told him to quit finance, George has saved enough money to rent his own apartment, buy decent clothes, and begin building the foundation of what will become a legendary career. But the most important change isn't financial, it's psychological. George has learned to trust his unconventional thinking instead of trying to conform to conventional expectations. Has learned that outsider perspective provides competitive advantage rather than career limitation. Has learned that being told you don't fit existing systems might mean you're designed to create better systems. Jonathan Green calls George into his office one morning in late March. George, I've been watching your development for almost a year. Your analytical approach, your trading instincts, your profit generation. I have a proposition. Yes, sir? Partnership. Junior partnership in Green & Associates, with equity stake and profit sharing. Are you interested? George stares at this man who offered him opportunity when everyone else offered rejection, who valued his unconventional thinking when everyone else demanded conformity, who proved that Professor Daniels was wrong about everything that mattered. But what George said next surprised Jonathan Green. Mr. Green, I'm deeply honored by your offer, but I need to ask for something else. What's that? Your recommendation for a position at a larger firm. Rothschild, or Warburg, or another established merchant bank. Jonathan Green looks confused. George, why would you want to leave when I'm offering you partnership? Because you've taught me that my unconventional approach works in currency markets. Now I want to test whether it works in larger markets, with larger positions, with larger opportunities. And if the established firms reject you? They will reject me initially, but they'll accept me eventually, because I can generate profits they can't generate with conventional approaches. You're that confident? George smiles. Mr. Green, 6 months ago I was broke and told I'd never succeed in finance. Today you're offering me partnership in a profitable firm. I've learned that other people's assessment of my limitations doesn't determine my actual potential. 4 months later, George Soros accepts a position at Singer & Friedlander, one of London's respected merchant banks. Not because they initially valued his unconventional background, but because his trading record at Green & Associates proved that unconventional thinking produces conventional profits. His starting salary at Singer & Friedlander exceeds Professor Daniels's full academic income. But the real victory isn't financial, it's philosophical. George has learned that when people tell you that you don't fit existing systems, they might be telling you that you're designed to transcend existing systems. Years later, after George Soros becomes the legendary speculator who breaks the Bank of England, makes billions in currency trading, and builds one of the world's most successful hedge funds, a financial journalist asks him about his early career struggles. Professor Daniels told you that you'd never succeed in finance, the journalist says. How did that affect you? George thinks for a moment. Professor Daniels was absolutely right about one thing. I didn't fit the requirements for success in British academic economics. But he was wrong about something more important. Those requirements were limitations, not advantages. What do you mean? Academic economics in 1953 required conformity to established theories, acceptance of institutional wisdom, deference to conventional analysis. Those requirements prevent the kind of independent thinking that identifies market opportunities. So, his rejection helped you? His rejection revealed the gap between what institutions claim to value and what markets actually reward. Institutions value conformity. Markets reward accuracy. Professor Daniels taught me that being rejected by institutions might mean you understand something institutions don't. Did you ever speak with him again? George smiles. In 1975, Professor Daniels attended a lecture I gave at Cambridge about currency speculation and reflexivity theory. After the lecture, he approached me. What did he say? He said he'd been wrong about my potential for academic success, that my unconventional approach had proven more valuable than he'd recognized, that he should have encouraged rather than discouraged my economic thinking. And what did you tell him? I told him he'd given me the most valuable education possible, learning to trust my analysis even when respected authorities disagree with it. Learning that being an outsider provides perspective that insiders can't access. Learning that the moment someone tells you that you'll never succeed is exactly the moment to prove them wrong. The journalist asks one final question. What advice would you give to young people who are told they don't have what it takes? George Soros thinks about £17 in a bank account, a mentor's devastating rejection, and 6 months that changed everything. Remember that people who tell you that you don't fit existing systems might be telling you that you're designed to create better systems, that the qualities they identify as weaknesses might be exactly the strengths you need for the challenges they can't imagine. That being rejected by one path might be preparation for succeeding on a different path that doesn't exist yet. Most importantly, remember that other people's limitations aren't your limitations. Their assessment of what's possible isn't the boundary of what you can achieve. Their failure to see your potential doesn't diminish your potential, it reveals the limits of their vision. Professor Henry Daniels was absolutely right about George Soros in March 1953. George didn't fit the requirements for academic success in British economics. But Professor Daniels was wrong about something more important. Those requirements were obstacles to greatness, not prerequisites for it. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is being told you'll never make it. Because that's when you discover whether you believe in other people's assessment of your potential more than you believe in your own ability to transcend their limitations. The Hungarian refugee with £17 and no connections became the most successful currency trader in history. Not despite being told he'd never succeed in finance, but because being told he'd never succeed taught him that the only opinion about his potential that matters is his own. So here's the question for you. Who's telling you that you don't have what it takes right now? What limitations are they placing on your potential? Because sometimes the people who crush your dreams accidentally teach you exactly what you need to succeed. And sometimes 6 months is all it takes to prove that their assessment of what's possible has nothing to do with what you can actually achieve. The mentor who tried to end George Soros's career in finance accidentally launched the most profitable trading career in history. The rejection that was supposed to destroy his confidence accidentally revealed his competitive advantages. That's what happens when you refuse to let other people's limitations become your reality.